We're joined now by Mick Mulroy, who's a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under President Trump. He joins us from Montana. Always a pleasure having you on the show, Mick. Let's start by talking about those talks that have been taking place in Geneva. Well, the two sets of talks, but let's talk about the Iran-US talks. We're told they reached an understanding on what they said the two sides were the main guiding principles, but it doesn't sound like we're anywhere close to reaching a deal. Is that your reading of where we are right now?
So, Tom, I think that's a fair reading, and I share it. Essentially, what's usually done during these negotiations is they develop a framework. So what it is they're going to be discussing inside these negotiations doesn't mean they've gotten to 0% enrichment, 3% enrichment, but they're going to talk about enrichment, for example. And that could also have essentially decided on whether to include ballistic missile production or support to proxy forces like Hezbollah. That's likely what they're saying. They haven't said what the framework is. But then, of course, they've given the Iranians 2 weeks to come back with an agreement that the United States would be acceptable with. So we'll see now whether this is going to go forward diplomatically or militarily.
All right, well, there are still some people out there, and we've been speaking to some of them, who say the US is just going through the motions. Bottom line here, Mick, does Washington genuinely want to deal with Iran, do you think?
I think they want the deal that they want. So it's not just about having a deal so they can find an off-ramp. It's about having a deal that, for political reasons and for practical reasons, is more stringent than the JCPOA. So that's the Obama-era nuclear agreement that this first Trump administration got out of. So they can't essentially go back to the same deal, or there'd be a lot of questions about what was the purpose of withdrawing and seeing Iran get to the 60% enriched uranium level. So it has to be more stringent than that. And I think that's why they're pushing for zero enrichment. And they might still be pushing for at least some restrictions on ballistic missiles. It's unclear. They're not saying that. But I do think the United States wants an agreement that they can say is better than the one they pull out of. But I also believe that this projection of force is not a bluff, that the United States is well prepared to use that force if these negotiations break down.
We'll come to that in just a moment, Mick. I just still want to understand your thinking here with regards to the US motivations and the direction things are heading in. Because, I mean, the Iran talks are happening in the same city at the same time, more or less, as the Ukraine talks, using the same US team of Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. I mean, some critics are saying that those two men, don't have the depth of knowledge that people, for example, the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has. That's just on the Iranian side. And then, of course, they're sitting opposite from the Russians as well. I mean, aren't they outmatched and overstretched?
It's clear. I mean, it's just factual. They don't have the same level of experience. You just mentioned Foreign Minister Araghchi. He worked on the original JCPOA. He is very well schooled, in depth on all the issues that goes into this type of agreement. It's very technical. Hopefully, Mr. Witkoff and Kushner have teams of experts that are with them from the intelligence community, potentially from the Department of Energy, which in the U.S., of course, is responsible for nuclear protocols. They need these expertise in order to be able to keep up with Araghchi, who he himself has the expertise. On the other side, it's a key, Medinsky, I believe is his name. He's a key advisor to President Putin, who's very well schooled on everything Ukraine and everything the Russians want to know. Of course, historically, there would be seasoned long-term career diplomats, either appointed or in the position of a professional State Department employee, plus many members from the intelligence community. That's just not the case here. They can supplement that with the expertise, essentially backseating them. But I haven't seen any real big names that would indicate that they're taking advantage of that really significant pool of expertise in the State Department and the intelligence community.
And just lastly, to press you on this matter of Geneva talks, I mean, why wasn't the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, there? Shouldn't he be involved in at least one of the two sets of talks?
Well, historically, it would be undersecretaries, which is not the case here. These are special envoys, if you will, but undersecretaries that do a lot of the groundwork, essentially to create the framework, to get to a place where the principles would then be brought in. And that is when they'd start getting down to the finalization of these agreements. Now, in this case, the foreign minister, as you already mentioned, Tom, is there. So that would indicate that perhaps Secretary Rubio should be there. But historically, it's usually the undersecretaries and even lower that develop the plan, and then the principals, the secretaries, the ministers come in to actually finalize it. So there's still plenty of time if Iran comes back with an agreement that the United States is acceptable with, and I think you will see Secretary Rubio out there, and potentially even President Trump. There's been some, at least media reports, that he'd be willing to become involved.
Okay, let's go back to talking about that US military buildup in the Middle East. You seem to be saying that that's not just leverage, that's actual preparation. Tell us more.
Well, I think it's clear that the United States is willing to take strikes in Iran. We've already seen that during the 12-day war with Operation Midnight Hammer, specifically by the United States against the nuclear facilities. So that has essentially already been done. So I don't think it's a far stretch to think that it could be done again. President Trump, I think, believes that his military actions in his second term has brought him success. But everything that's happening right now indicates it's not just for a limited strike, say, on Fordow. It looks like it's for a extended, sustained, multi-week, potentially even over a month military campaign, not only to degrade the nuclear sites, but also the ballistic missile production sites, launching sites, and potentially even regime targets. I mean, this will be the second aircraft carrier strike group. There's already about 8 or 9 destroyers, about 6 or 7 cruisers, squadrons of aircraft that can be used from the ground, F-15s, F-22s, F-35s. It is substantial. It is a huge buildup, and it indicates to me that this is the U.S. military is preparing for a long, sustained campaign if given the order.
Right, because they can't just turn around and go back to the US unless the deal is absolutely bulletproof and frankly markedly different from the 2015 deal, can they?
Right. I mean, it would be, you can only bluff so many times. If this agreement fell apart and there wasn't one that the U.S. was willing to accept, and then we just turned around all of these naval and air assets, I think it'd be the last time we could use this as sort of a forcing function. And I don't believe the president wants to be known for that. So I think for real reasons, the United States does believe, according to open source reporting, that Iran is starting to rebuild these nuclear facilities that we degraded. And it is a very real threat, of course, as Iran builds up their ballistic missile capacity again. So it might be that the U.S. does take these strikes and then goes back to Iran and says, well, now your nuclear facility is even more degraded. Your ballistic missile capability is significantly degraded. You want us to talk about a new nuclear agreement now? Because they can keep doing that essentially to force them into this agreement that they would want. And of course, the economic circumstances are dire in Iran. The United States is talking about additional secondary sanctions that could make it even worse. They could essentially use this maximum pressure campaign to keep pushing Iran closer and closer to an agreement that the Trump administration would accept.
Right, and we've been told, you were alluding to it there, the world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, due in the region in 2 weeks from now. One of the military officials, a retired US general we spoke to yesterday, hinted at the idea that 2-week time frame could actually be something of a smokescreen, in the sense that it gives everyone a false sense of security that nothing's going to happen for the next 2 weeks. And knowing, as you do, as we all do, in fact, that President Trump likes an element of surprise. We saw that last June. Might we be about to see that again?
Quite possible, Tom. That is a tactic to gain the element of surprise. Of course, Iran has 2 weeks to come back with an agreement. I don't think that's a coincidence. But it's not like you have to have every asset in the region to launch. In fact, that could be used, as you just referenced, Tom, that we could have a running start. Essentially, we could start these strikes, and then the second aircraft carrier shows up to the region and then joins in the fight. There's no reason necessarily to have everything in place before this starts. And there's other assets we've been talked about. I mean, there's nuclear submarines with considerable amounts of TLAMs or Tomahawk missiles that are somewhere in the region. There, of course, their location is generally classified, but all they have to do is get into the right range. So we could see hundreds and hundreds of Tomahawk missiles coming down on sites in Iran before the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier strike force even gets to the region. But then when it does, that's just one more element that the U.S. can use to sustain operations.
Okay, but there is a new element to all of this. There's a new dimension, which is that those military drills that have been conducted by the Iranians in the Strait of Hormuz are about to be broadened to include Russian naval assets and possibly Chinese as well. I don't know what you read into that and whether you think this perhaps complicates or changes Washington's calculations.
Certainly, Iran, Russia, China have been allies for some time. I don't see them becoming actively involved in a conflict with the United States. That's obviously a nuclear power against two nuclear powers. And I don't think they would commit that for Iran. But there's a lot of concern about Iran sea mining the Straits of Hormuz. About 20% of the world's energy supply flows through there. And it is a very real possibility. The Iranians have the capacity to do that. The parliament has already approved them doing that if the supreme leader orders that. But I would say that is largely going to affect, of course, the countries in the region, to include Iran, who sends their oil through this strait and has no, protection against sea mines any more than any other company. And it largely affects the Indo-Pacific region, particularly China. The United States doesn't really rely on much energy from the Middle East. So it's a calculated step that Iran would take, and it would have major global repercussions, but it would largely be focused on Iran and the countries that were impacted. And if they do that, really the only country that can clear it is the United States, and that could take weeks or months. And then you'd still have to convince these insurance companies that it's worth insuring vessels that are going through that strait, because that's a commercial enterprise. So it's a lot of issues that would go with that. It would be a huge step. But that is likely why the Iranians and now Chinese and Russians are doing these exercises in this region. There's also a threat, at least in media reports, that the United States could do a naval blockade. So that could be another reason why these naval exercises are taking place, just to show that they have the capacity potentially to break that blockade.
Mick, just to wrap up this conversation, let me put you on the spot, if you don't mind. What's your hunch? Are we today, at the conclusion of this latest round of talks, indirect talks in Geneva, closer to a deal, or are we closer to a regional war?
Fortunately, I think we're closer to a regional war. I think it's close one way or the other, so it's not a lopsided analysis. But Iran, quite frankly, never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. If they could essentially get to an agreement where they don't enrich uranium, there is the low enriched uranium bank that they have the capacity and capability of utilizing to do the civilian uses of low enriched uranium. They don't need to do it themselves. And what would that get them? Major sanctions relief, which is the primary squeeze on the regime right now. It's why literally almost the whole country is protesting against the regime, because economics, of course, affects everyone. So I think they have a great opportunity for themselves and for the Iranian people. But unfortunately, in the past, we've seen them miss these opportunities. And I don't see the United States pulling back if that's the case, and not taking at least some limited strikes. But I believe they have the capacity to take major strikes. And then they'll go back to the negotiation board and see if that changes the perspective of Iran, who can either elect to accept it and go with negotiations, or potentially escalate it, like they are saying, publicly messaging, which could mean a significant regional war, something I think none of us should want to see. We should all hope that diplomacy wins the day here.
All right, we really appreciate you sharing that with us. Mick Mulroy, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under President Trump. Thank you for your time, sir.